Another big set of Warhammer 40k rules leaks today, and what seems to be a fairly common occurrence from Games Workshop. Let's talk 10th edition missions, terrain guidelines, an interesting line of sight buff for knights, and the full rules for army construction, all leaked to the internet. Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics, where today we're talking about the 10th edition core rules for Warhammer 40k once more, which it finally seems like we've got the full set of them from the Leviathan book now. The standard rules for Warhammer 40k are entirely unveiled. Over the past few weeks, people seem to have been leaking these bit by bit. First we had a whole load of pictures of the core book taken as photos in someone's car, then a few more bits came out with things like unit coherency and engagement range. Then that was followed up by Mr. Honest Wargamer's very nice video on how to play Warhammer 40k. That filled in most of the last gaps with things like dedicated transports and flyers, but we still had a few things missing, including standard mission rules and a few other bits. Now it seems that not content with this, someone has taken matters into their own hands, actually scanned the full core rules for 40k 9th edition and uploaded them to the internet, and now they've been quite widely circulated. In this video I'll talk through 5 of the most interesting areas, the latest clarifications and surprises that maybe weren't entirely clear. Besides stuff I've already talked about on the channel, I'd say the most interesting things out of this are example terrain and battlefields to use, the full army construction rules, rather than the slightly rough and ready guide that Games Workshop gave, an example of an actual mission with the full rules for say who goes first and when objectives are scored, an interesting knight line of sight buff which seems quite good for towering models, and other things that aren't here, things like deep strike, fortification deployment, and titanic rules. Let's go through them all bit by bit. First up, maybe a slightly more minor thing, but I was interested to see what sort of battlefields Games Workshop envisaged 10th edition being played on. I feel like that was maybe one of the better strengths of 9th edition. They actually said, yes, you should be playing with a decent amount of terrain, otherwise the other poor player's just going to get shot off the board when your army goes first. The board sizes are still 44 by 60 inches, so no change in the main board size there, at least in terms of main Strike Force games. I think that this is also recommended for Incursion now. In general, it looks like the terrain density compared with 9th edition hasn't really changed too much. I think that's probably a good thing, really. Provided there's a decent amount of line of sight blocking terrain in the middle and in the opponent's deployment zones, that's perhaps the main thing. Being able to hide your most important units is pretty critical in Warhammer 40k to stop the player going first from having a big advantage in killing their opponent's things. They give an example like this one for a match play example of a battlefield, and then have them set up in other funky ways for more narrative games. They have one where there's a big city on either side and a bit of a killing field down the middle. They also give an example of a combat patrol battlefield with a good mix of terrain features and things, again noting things like lines of sight not being able to be drawn directly across the entire battlefield in very many places. Maybe a little bit less critical to be super duper balanced at combat patrol, as it's usually going to be a bit skewed in one way or another anyway, just from being at a small points mode, but still best to make sure that terrain isn't going to be too big a factor in who wins and loses. On a few of these they do basically say that try not to use massively more than this, otherwise the combat armies are going to have a big advantage over shooting, and don't play on a barren empty battlefield, otherwise shooting armies will have a much bigger advantage there. Overall seems fairly sensible and pretty similar to 9th. Then moving on, one of the pages that hadn't leaked yet was the full army construction rules. Perhaps this was one that people were a little bit less excited for, seeing as Games Workshop had kind of run through the basics of it anyway. But I feel like there were still a few things that weren't 100% clarified, things like enhancements and who they could be given to, plus things like sub-faction keywords which we've seen at least one of on Reboot Guilliman. The 10th edition army construction rules really are enormously straightforward, much more so than 9th edition. Hugely simplified, with no battlefield roles or detachments or anything. Units are just limited per each datasheet. There's 3 main game modes: Incursion, Strike Force and Onslaught, 1000, 2000 and 3000 points. They don't seem to be going for points ranges quite as much this time round. In the core book they say that points are going to be listed either in the Munitorum Field Manual or in the codexes. Seems like that'll be a similar system of 9th. Probably a field manual when the edition drops to download, and then when a codex is updated, I guess they'll list all the points out again, perhaps to reflect datasheet updates. They then say that you can record your list on an army roster, either just on paper or the 40k app, which apparently is being redone for 10th edition. They did forget to mention Battlescribe in the book though, so I'll mention that now. Then you pick your faction down in the bottom right hand corner of those datasheets, whether it's Adeptus Astartes, Grey Knights, World Eaters or Eldari. Interestingly enough though, I was expecting them to say something about the sub-faction keyword that we saw for Guilliman. He had the Ultramarines one, and Games Workshop in previous interviews had said that you'd only be able to take special characters from one given Space Marine chapter and not mix and match ones from say Ultramarines and Raven Guard. I'd guess that if that's not here, it might well be in the actual data cards for Space Marines. I think there's a reasonable chance that it's a restriction that's just completely unique to them. Most other armies don't have vast amounts of characters locked to one sub-faction or another. Space Marines just have a whole load more going on with that. Then when you pick your faction, you pick your detachment for that faction. They all come with at least one to start off with in their data card sets. The codexes will add a bunch more for each faction and different ways to play the armies, and some of them might have restrictions as to what sort of units you can bring along. Then moving forward from there, you actually start to add your units into the roster. Starting out, you must have at least one character unit. You've got to have one to nominate as the warlord for your army. But then beyond having at least one character, you basically get to have 0 to 3 of just about any datasheet. The main exceptions are epic heroes, which basically represent unique named characters, like say Kayvan Shrike, Brute Gilliman, or the Silent King. You can only have one of each of those, so no doubling up. And then some units you can take 0 to 6 of, dedicated transports and battle line units, though dedicated transports must start the game with a unit embarked in them or they get destroyed. Means that you can't just spam, say, empty wave serpents or something if it made sense to. They do actually have to be acting as transports if you're going to get so easy access to them, I suppose. Then perhaps one of the ones that I was most interested to hear confirmed is enhancements. These ones work basically as I would have guessed. There's no generic ones, so you have to pick them within your detachment. You can only enhance non-named characters, so you can't give these to epic heroes. They are free, they don't cost any points or command points like they used to, and you can't double up with these on characters, you can only give one per character. So there's a bit less stacking of unusual relics and warlord traits that you might have had in ninth. Might incentivize you to take at least 2 or 3 characters, so you can at least pick up the better enhancements out of your options, as they're free. Finally, for some reason the last step is selecting your warlord. You just have to nominate one of your character choices as the overall leader. It doesn't give them any extra rules or anything like that, but I guess it will be more relevant for certain mission objectives. I feel like it's quite likely that in those cards you'll have some sort of one for Slay the Warlord. Overall seems pretty simple and effective, quite a lot more intuitive than the great big detachment system that Ninth was going with. Next up, and perhaps a slightly unexpected change, is an alteration in line of sight for knights. The full text of the terrain section hadn't leaked yet, so I guess people hadn't spotted this yet. In Games Workshop's terrain preview, they told us that towering units and aircraft would be able to be seen over the top of ruins. They can still draw line of sight over and through them, but what they didn't say this time round is that they themselves will also be able to target things behind ruins, it seems. In this visibility section for ruins, it says that visibility to and from such models is determined normally, even if this terrain features wholly in between them. These rules have definitely changed from 9th edition in a few ways. Previously, it wasn't the towering keyword, it was the Titanic keyword that gave you this exemption, so you might have Titanic units like the Baneblades that aren't towering, and these will now potentially be able to hide behind particularly big line of sight blocking ruins. The fact that these guys can now see and be seen across ruins, though, is quite a big deal. It means that while the knights and things won't be able to hide behind terrain, your units now won't be able to hide behind terrain themselves, so you might potentially have knights with big scary guns just shooting your army, unless the terrain that you're playing on happens to be particularly dense and doesn't have any gaps in it. For people who have these towering and aircraft units, particularly Imperial Knight players, this will be really quite a big boost. Previously it was basically all one way. You could be in the frustrating situation where you could have units that were shooting you from just behind terrain. They could see you as they could basically ignore the obscuring rule of that terrain, whereas the knight wouldn't be able to ignore it, and he could be shot but not get to shoot back. On the one hand, I can perhaps see why they're doing this. I guess if their foes are always able to shoot the knights, it kind of makes sense that the knights will be able to shoot them. But in terms of actual practicalities for the game, I'm not sure it's the best change in the world. It sounds like they might have created themselves a bit of a weird scenario for if you're playing with or against knights. Basically, if you're playing on a table with lots of ruins with windows in, the knights are just going to be able to shoot basically whatever all over the board. But on the other hand, if you're playing a game on a bunch of ruins that don't have holes made for windows, then the knights are going to have a really bad time and still probably not going to be able to see their foes. Let me know what you make of this one anyway. I must admit I'm not sure it's my favourite change that I've seen so far. Being able to hide your units from enemy alpha strikes with massive guns is quite an important part of the tactics of 40k, otherwise the player that goes first when they're playing with or against big stompy knights might have a massive advantage. Next up, one of the things that hadn't really been covered by the leak so far, and I was pretty intrigued to see, was the example mission Only War that comes in the back of the book. This one's designed to be a sort of starter mission, not quite as in-depth as that battle deck mission card thing that they have going on, and that itself is going to be another interesting part of the puzzle when we get to find out what's on those cards. Still though, this example mission gives us a pretty decent idea as to how things like deployment and first turn are going to be working. They do have a core rules section for that, but it's kind of vague in a bunch of places, just saying it will be determined by the mission. First up, in this mission there's a few objective details. This is one where the players place the objectives and must put them greater than 6 inches from board edges and greater than 9 inches from other objectives. If anything, I feel like that might be just a little bit too freeform, really. You just basically have the incentive to put them as far back into your own territory as you possibly can. I feel like it's a bit more interesting when you have some points in the midfield to scrap over. Perhaps the more interesting bit is that the objectives are scored here at the end of the command phase. That does tally with the mission card preview that we had. It does seem that this is going to be the place where objectives are normally scored in 10th edition. In this particular mission, it's nice and simple. The player whose turn it is scores 1 victory point to a maximum of 3 victory points per turn for each objective that they control. As it happens in their command phase, it means that the opponent will have the opportunity to try and kill their units off the objectives before they get to score. It does seem that the end of the command phase thing might well need an FAQ. I've seen a surprising amount of debate on it online between Necron reanimation protocols and this, just due to a few other things that are said in the command phase section. I can see the point of both sides, but to me the end of the command phase does seem really quite specific to me. As a specific rule, I feel like it overrides any other generic rules that are within that section. My take would be that this and reanimation protocols happens after Battle Shock, though it does seem to be an area that could probably do with an FAQ just so everyone's on the same page. Then for the actual sequence kicking off the game, you roll for attacker and defender. It looks like now, rather than picking sides of the board, both the attackers and defenders sides are already preset. You can see them marked in the two different sides of the board here. Looks like the only major change that has for a bunch of match play missions will probably be who gets to drop the first unit. After that, you have the new declare battle formations set. This is where you now declare leaders and what bodyguards they're going in, reserves like deep strike and strategic reserve, hovering flyers and transport occupants. Technically, you're supposed to note all this down secretly and then reveal them to the opponent, though I feel like in most games people are just going to wind up telling them what they're doing. Then you get to the deploy armies step, alternating units starting with the attacker for ones in your deployment zone, and then for things that deploy after the most units, like infiltrators and things, you then roll off again, and the winner of that roll off gets to put down the first unit of infiltrators, and then you alternate. You then roll for first turn, it doesn't go to the attacker or defender automatically or anything. The player who rolled to go first gets to move any scout units that they had first, followed by the player going second. Then you go through the normal turn sequences 5 times, trying to destroy your opponent's army and score the objectives, and the game ends at the end of the 5th battle round. Interestingly, for this starter mission, it looks like tabling the opponent does win the game in this mode. It'll be interesting to see whether that returns for 10th edition's main mission sets. Currently in 9th edition you can be tabled but still win if you've done enough to win on the objectives beforehand. Otherwise, if neither player tables the other, then it's the player with the most victory points at the end of the game who wins overall. Overall, I'd say there's a lot more similarities than there are differences. I think I'm kind of happy enough that neither player really gets to choose which board edge they're going to be on now. Obviously, you could always do it different for narrative games and things. Alternating the infiltrators seems sensible enough, though I feel like the player going first being able to move all their scouts before their opponent is quite a big advantage. That might just add a little bit toward first turn advantage in 10th edition. It'll be interesting to see whether tabling the opponent still gives you an auto win in the actual main mission set. Maybe in the heightened durability world of 10th edition it might not be the worst thing in the world, might be a little bit more rare than how it is now. Finally, now we've got the full set of the core rules unveiled, it's interesting to see what's not here as well. Hard to confirm that anything is indeed absent until we've seen the full set. There's probably a fair few more examples than this, but these 4 stuck out to me a bit, and perhaps more than most, the continued absence of anything that prevents deep strike units coming in from turn 1. Currently it's just strategic reserve units that have to come in turn 2 or later. There also doesn't seem to be any restriction as to how many units you can put in deep strike if you're playing that mission. It looks like you could put your entire army in. Could just be a bit brutal if everything's just turning up and laying into the opponent with some enormous guns turn 1. Seems a bit alpha strikey to me. There definitely could be something in the mission cards that prohibits it though, that's where it was last time, though if so I don't really know why they wouldn't just build it into the core rules. Another thing that doesn't seem to have made the jump from the 9th edition FAQs to 10th edition is any special rules for setting up fortifications. I guess we could potentially find out differently if they all have something listed on their datasheets, but now barring any weirdness either in the mission deployment rules or on their datasheets, looks like fortifications will be able to set up nearby other terrain pieces, allowing them to be a lot more playable in game. In 9th edition they had that restriction where you couldn't set them up within 3 inches of any terrain piece, and that was just massively restrictive on some crowded boards. You might have some places where they just couldn't deploy whatsoever unless you swapped out one of your terrain pieces for them. One thing that it seems is completely absent in the shooting phase is any special rules for Titanic units falling back and shooting. That was something that they were able to do in 9th edition, but it doesn't seem like it's made the jump here. It seems that the current system for most Titanic units is they're just going to be able to remain in combat and fire straight out of it, as per the big guns never tire rule. That is a pretty nice advantage, though I'd say it's probably less powerful than being able to fall back and shoot. They'd be taking the -1 to hit penalty, and they might prohibit other units on your team from shooting the things that are in combat with them. I guess the Imperial Knights might have some sort of exception. We've still got that super heavy Walker rule that we haven't seen that I guess is going to be in their data cards. Finally, for fly units, as best I can tell from my reading of the rules, it does look like they're not able to just go through ruin walls or anything now. Infantry that fly will still be able to do that through their rules, but things like flying monstrous creatures will have to fly around things like ruin walls, not just go straight through them. They could also go over, moving diagonally up and diagonally down, but that does seem at least to be a minor nerf to fly units, at least not infantry ones. In any case, pretty cool to see a few more answers from the 10th edition core rules. If there's anything else major that I've missed that I've not covered on the channel previously, feel free to let me know down in the comments. I might do a follow-up video if it's something particularly interesting. Otherwise, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k news and discussion coming. I'm sure I'll have plenty more going into 10th edition. Finally, if you have been finding all this stuff on the channel useful, then I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.